Hi everyone, my name is Yumi Pak. I am Associate Professor of English and Director of Ethnic Studies at California State University, San Bernardino. My primary kind of teaching fields are within Black literary and cultural studies, queer theory and performance studies, and I've written kind of a few pieces that have been published in a couple of journals. But I think maybe more interesting than that, what I can share with you is I am a huge nerd. Like, reading is one of my favorite things. And so I'm delighted to have the opportunity to join Norco Library and kind of share some ideas and reading recommendations with you.
I'm so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for agreeing. So the first thing I'd really like to ask you, and I think this is something that's going to interest the people viewing this, is how did you originally decide to go into academia?
Thank you for that question. So I'm going to give you a kind of long-winded answer, if that's okay. When I was growing up, I was told that, college was the path. This was the thing that I was going to do. And being a first generation college student, my parents were very supportive, but they didn't quite know what it meant to be a college student. And subsequently, that meant that I didn't quite know what it meant to be a college student. And when I got there and I was, taking my classes and hustling, my professors said, "Have you considered grad school?" And I did not know what that meant. And working with them and kind of learning from them, I decided that I wanted to pursue the PhD. Sometimes my students at CSUSB will ask me, "How did you make that decision?" And I very honestly say, number one, graduation was coming up and I didn't know what I was going to do with the literature and women's studies double, right? And number two, being told that I could be paid to teach was something that, number one, had never occurred to me. Like, I didn't realize that I could actually teach and be in a classroom with students. And number two, growing up working class meant that any amount of money sounded like a treasure trove, right? So I think sometimes students want me to give them like this was a calling kind of answer. And I tell them, I loved reading, that much is true, but also it was a very pragmatic decision. This is something that made sense to me at the time, right? And in terms of how I kind of continued my journey in academia, for those of us who remember that long ago, in 2008, the economy crashed, right? Mm-hmm. And so for people who I think earned their PhDs before 2008, there were more jobs. I think that is true. And for those of us who earned our degrees after 2008, there was a glut of recent PhDs and very few jobs available. And I always like to tell people that, yes, you're working hard, but if everybody who worked hard ended up in academia, a lot more people I know would be in academia, right? And so I remember telling my parents, you know what, I'm going to go on the job market and I'll try it for a couple of years. And if it works, great, I'll try it, I'll see what happens. And if it doesn't, I'm not afraid of doing other kinds of work, right? I'm trained to think expansively. I'm trained to think toward a more socially just world. And there are many venues where I can pursue that kind of work. And because this answer is already very long, I'll kind of cut it short, but it worked out for me. And I'm very lucky in many ways that it did. And I'm really, really thrilled to be primarily an instructor. That is the work of being with students is the thing I love the most. So that is how I ended up here.
Right. And now we are here and you are a very good professor.
Thank you.
I might say. As a follow-up, I'm really curious to know how you found your way specifically to Black literature and how you found your way to Toni Morrison along your kind of long road in academia.
Yeah. So there's a couple of ways I can answer that question. The first is that my high school had a wide array of English courses that were offered, and I took all of them. Like I knew that this was something I was interested in, and one of my teachers introduced me to Toni Morrison and suggested I read The Bluest Eye. And I read it. I was very young and could not make heads or tails of it. Like,
right, of course.
Morrison is such a powerful, evocative, beautiful writer. And, grappling with the content of her work is one thing, and then grappling with the structure of her work is another thing. And so I just remember reading her and thinking, I don't know what's going on, but I'm intrigued. I kind of, that was my first encounter with Morrison. In terms of how I ended up pursuing Black literary studies, African American literature, I read two more books in high school. Well, no, that's a lie. I read one more book in high school and a part of another book. The first book that I read my junior year of high school was Nella Larsen's Passing, which I know you are familiar with.
Yes.
It was not part of my curriculum, but my teacher, who was fantastic, encouraged us to read it, and we did. And then the part of the book that I remember reading is an excerpt from Jean Toomer's Cane. And both Jean Toomer and Nella Larsen, of course, were writers during the Harlem Renaissance, right? And those books just stayed with me. Like, I could not stop thinking about them. They were just in my mind all the time. And then in college, I took classes where I was reading those books kind of over and over again. And so when I was applying for graduate school, I was kind of torn because the department that I was coming out of thought about literatures in the plural and the relationships between literatures. I actually applied to graduate school as an Asian Americanist. Like, I went in thinking I would do a dissertation on specifically literatures of the Korean diaspora. That's what I was thinking. And throughout grad school, I took classes, read more different kinds of works. And by the time I was taking my exams for the master's degree, and I had to write my thesis, Jean Toomer's Cane had not gone anywhere. Like, that was the book that was continuously just in my mind going, you have something to say about me. What is the thing you want to say? And so I wrote my thesis on Jean Toomer's Cane. And then when I was speaking to my advisor, as with many, many fantastic advisors, she gave me really practical advice and said, you can love many things, but you can't do everything, right? Like, you have to think about where you want to go with this degree. And so part of my decision, or part of my way to Black literary studies, and also ultimately to Toni Morrison, was through her urging, right? Like, if this is what you're writing your thesis on, these are the texts that are most interesting to you, then it might be worth pursuing this particular field of inquiry, right? And the other part of it that came up for me was, I realized that in order to understand what we might call American literature, we actually have to understand the histories of Black and Native and Indigenous peoples. Like, unless that is centered, everything else doesn't make sense, right? And so part of it was, again, like a narrowing down and the kind of books that were loudest in my mind. Part of it was, well, no matter what else I do, this is something that I'm going to have to know. Like, that is an ethics of responsibility and care that I think are really important. And then part of it was, these are the books I love. Like, they're the ones that I think just move me in ways that perhaps other texts don't as much. I read more and more of Toni Morrison, throughout my academic career, and it just made sense to me that this was the direction that I moved in. And in terms of why Toni Morrison specifically, at least in terms of teaching, it's because I think if I had to pick one author, like if it was that kind of situation, there's one author I think students have to read in order to make sense of our contemporary moment. Terms like settler colonialism or anti-Blackness, right? How we think about empire, how we think about, the liveness of history. Who is that author? Who is that author? Who was that author for me? And who is that author in my field of study? And it's Toni Morrison. And that's how I ended up kind of really wanting to keep reading her, but also teaching her and writing about her.
Right. And Toni Morrison's works, I think you specifically have been very foundational for me in literature and in exploring American literature particularly. I do want to ask if you came to find Black feminism through Toni Morrison's work, or is that something that happened concurrently?
That's a great question. So I think Toni Morrison, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on too, but I think Toni Morrison offers us really complex blueprints of what we might call Black feminism, right? Did I know that that's what I was studying when I was initially reading her? No, right? I read The Bluest Eye, and then I read Song of Solomon in my intro to literature class when I in college. And then I think I read Beloved in a class on law and property. I think that's actually how I first encountered Toni Morrison's most famous work, arguably, Beloved. Right?
That's a very interesting place to encounter.
Yeah, and I mean, it was because, as you know, there were all of these conversations around Black peoples as property, right? So in a class on how law shapes our notions of thinking about property and the figure of the human, my professor was like, how can we not read Toni Morrison? Like, that book is such a critical component of how we think about this history and how we think about these logics at play. And so I don't know that I knew that that's what I was reading. That's what I was reading for, or that was the name of what I would kind of call what Toni Morrison was doing, until I started reading other Black feminist theorists, right? Okay. And it was taking place somewhat in my literature courses, but I would say it was much more visible in my women's studies courses. And so when I started reading, Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Assata Shakur, Fannie Lou Hamer. Like, when I started reading this group of scholars, this group of activists and theorists who we kind of call Black feminist theorists or Black feminist scholars, they either, number one, kept invoking Toni Morrison, right? Or I saw my professors kind of bringing in Toni Morrison, right? And that's when I started also reading some of her nonfiction. And that's when it all started coming together for me in a really kind of, when I think back on it, and Natalie, I'm sure you've had these moments too, but it was one of those things where when I think back on it, I'm like, it's so obvious. Like, how did I not know that going into it? But it took like a few different authors, a few different readings, and a little bit of time for me to kind of get there.
Yeah, I think it's seeing the crossroads of these things are very obvious in retrospect.
Yes.
But if you're not the person living these experiences, I think you kind of have to come on them a little bit less organically.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I'm sure I know you and I've talked about this before too, but I think part of it is that Morrison is really known for her fiction, her novels. I mean, that's a huge generalization, but I would say that is true. And I think sometimes, unless we are students of literature, and I don't mean in the university setting, I just mean in general, right? We don't always see literature as a site where politics or theorizing are happening, right? Like as someone who teaches literature, as someone who is trained to be thinking about literature, much like yourself, I know that there are some people who would kind of look at what we do and think, you're just reading stories, right? Like you need to read the history books. Yeah, you need to read the political treatises. Like these are the things that I've been told before. And one of the things that Morrison does so beautifully, as well as many writers of fiction, is they're actually challenging us and saying, if you think that literature is really limited in what it's doing, that's on you, right? Because as someone who writes literature, I know that I'm folding in all of these different things and actually making a particular kind of political or intellectual or cultural statement.
Right. Yeah. With all that said about Toni Morrison, I do kind of want to move into another topic, and I really wanted to ask if there are any other, women or non-binary folk, genderqueer people that you look to in history, either recent or ancient, that you either admire or just kind of come back to as a touchstone.
Yeah, I'll start with the most. Sorry, a very cute fat squirrel just ran across my window. Sorry, that's why I was really distracted. I'll start with someone who's fairly contemporary because our loss of her was so sudden. Bell Hooks is a writer and a thinker who is so foundational for many of us who work in Black studies, in feminist studies, and kind of even more broad fields. And she passed relatively recently, and she had written kind of widely and expansively, but there's a book of hers called Teaching to Transgress, and it's a fairly old book now, but it was the first text I read that helped me understand what teaching makes possible, right? And what teaching can be. And while I had really amazing teachers in high school and amazing professors in college, it wasn't until I read that book in a class at the college level that I understood what my teachers were trying to do, right? Because when you're young, you're like, oh, this teacher's cool, or, this teacher's mean, or I don't like this teacher, but we don't quite know why we think those things.
Right.
And Hooks was someone who really helped me understand, oh, if a teacher is approaching me and approaching the text in this way, it's not just because they're cool or they're nice. It's because they actually want me to think about how I am an active part of this conversation, right? So Bell Hooks is one. Another, now I'll go kind of way back in time, and I'll keep myself limited in my examples, but the other author I teach all the time, in addition to Toni Morrison, is Harriet Jacobs, because I think her slave narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, really is a key text in what we might call Black feminist theory or Black feminisms, right? She wasn't calling herself by that, right? In the 1800s, she wasn't calling herself a Black feminist, but the way she theorizes the world, the way she theorizes capital, the way she theorizes gender, like all of these different things. So many scholars who I look to her, right, as a kind of, this is where so much of this generates, right? She is the person who originates so many of these things,
right?
And so she's another person I would turn to, and then just two more people I would name. Number one is Yurikochiyama, who was an Asian American activist in the mid 20th century and further on. But Yurikochiyama was an Asian American activist who understood the significance of Black struggle and Black liberation, right? And really argued for really argued that we cannot understand the racializing of Asian peoples, Asian American peoples, without thinking about the work that Black and Black diasporic activists, writers, communities had already done, right? Yurikochiyama was also just really important to me because when I was growing up, the kind of, and still to this day, the predominant narrative around Asian Americans is to be the model minority, right? Like, we've assimilated and we've made it, and if we've done it, why can't other communities of color? And that,
right,
we're either kind of used to support that narrative, or unfortunately sometimes we buy into that narrative. And Yurikochiyama was one of my earliest examples of someone being like, you know what, no, like, I know exactly what you're trying to do when you try and pigeonhole me in this way. And I actually also know the intense dangers if I kind of believe in this thing.
Yes.
Right? So she was really important. And I mean, the last one is very personal to me, but it's my mom. Like, how can I not think about all of the things that my mother went through, right? And I think this is true for many of the kind of older women, older men, older non-binary and genderqueer people in many of my students' lives, right? Where if we're lucky, if we're fortunate, our caretakers are our first and earliest teachers. And they kind of direct us into how we want to think about the world. And, like, I'm not saying my mom's perfect, right? Like, we squabble and we don't see eye to eye. And especially as I've gotten older, there are definitely moments where politically we do not agree, right? And that's okay. Like, it happens, right? But she was my first example of the kind of person I wanted to be in the world. So, I mean, it's cheesy, but it's true. Like, she was the earliest teacher of a particular kind of feminist politics that I still very much believe in.
I wouldn't say that it's cheesy. I would say it's very sweet, but also that our parents are the foundation.
Yes.
Foundations.
Yes. And like, again, like, I think sometimes it's when they're fantastic examples, that's wonderful, right? Because then you grow up kind of like, my sister and my brother and I talk about this a lot, but my parents, for example, never said to me when I was growing up, oh, because you're a girl, you can't, right? Or because you are not this, you can't, right? It was always, no, like, whatever it is you're setting your mind to, is possible, right? My mom and her friends also, all of whom were immigrants to the United States, right? They took care of each other. They took care of each other's kids, right? They took care of each other's needs, right? And at the heart of it, that's what like a feminism of, that's what a woman of color feminism is, right? That yes, we're dismantling structures of oppression that exist. That's a long goal, but an immediate goal is also a practice of care, where you're like, I'm trying to care for as many people as possible outside of just, this is my child or this is my husband or whatever, right? And kind of getting to see that as I grew up really shaped how I think about teaching, how I think about friendship, how I think about what it means to be a part of a community, right? And I mean, she would deny this, right? She'd be like, no, like, you went to college and you learned these things. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, I read a lot, but the basics were already in place, right? And for other things, and again, I think for some of us, for other things, we learn what to do by doing what our parents aren't doing.
Right.
Yeah.
It's definitely, you did go to college and learn all those things, but it's you're learning to put words to the communion that's already there.
Yeah.
And speaking of communion, I am really curious about your thoughts on public libraries, because we are a public library interviewing you.
Yeah.
And I would really just like to ask if there's anything that you see public libraries, specifically in Southern California, doing that you like and maybe would like to see more of, or if there's anything that we're not doing that you would definitely like to see implemented.
That is a really, really good question. And the first thing I will immediately say is public libraries are the best. Like I just like everywhere I go, I get a library card because I'm like, well, if I'm going to be here, then I'm going to be using the public library, right? I think this was especially true during, and I say during, which implies that the pandemic is over. It is not. I'll rephrase, or you can edit this out. But I think in the first year of the pandemic, the first year and a half, public libraries are what gave me solace, or what gave me hope, in that, and I know it's funding dependent, but many libraries just put as many ebooks as available as possible. Like this is what I was seeing, right? That prior to March of 2020, my public library system, which is the Alameda County Library System, that's the one I still predominantly use. They didn't have very many ebooks available. There was a smattering, because the idea was, of course, you would go borrow books, which is something that is one of my favorite things to do, right? But with the lockdown, when that became impossible or difficult, it really felt like librarians and library systems just put their energy into trying to make as many things possible and available to as many patrons as possible, right? And they kept me, I don't think this is a lie, they kept me sane. I'm like, I did a lot of other things during the pandemic, but I also read just so much, because number one, I wanted to educate myself on what was going on in the world, but also number two, sometimes I needed an escape, and I needed to be in a universe that was not this one, right? And any book you fall into is a different kind of world, right? So public libraries forever, that's what I would say. I also wrote a lot of my job applications in a public library. I wrote much of my dissertation sitting in a public library over the summer months. I think in addition to the availability of reading materials, public libraries are usually spaces of safety for a lot of people, right? Yes. For people who are unhoused or in precarious housing situations. Sometimes the library is the way they have internet access to apply for jobs, to look for housing assistance, right? Sometimes if it's a working class household, or a household where the finances are perhaps a little bit more worrisome, libraries have programming for kids, and parents can take their kids there, right? A lot of people, excuse me, I know, offered their tutoring classes in libraries because, for whatever reason, the parents or the children did not have adequate space in their homes for tutoring lessons to happen, right? So I think that the misunderstanding of the public library is, oh, it's just a bunch of books. And I'm like, yes, and I love the bunches of books that are there, but I think libraries are places where, and you were making this connection too, Natalie, libraries are places where community becomes possible.
Yes.
Right? And funding should always be provided in order to enrich those community spaces as much as possible. So the things that I've seen that I think are really great in various different library counties are, I've seen a lot of different counties focusing on doing like community talks or community engagement around many of the issues that the pandemic have brought to light, right? Where it's not to say that these issues did not exist before, it's just more people started paying attention, right? So I've seen, for example, a lot of libraries organizing around housing, right? Like, okay, why do housing laws look this way? Can we bring in a community organizer to talk about, rent control, to talk about gentrification, right? A lot of, or maybe not a lot, but I see libraries doing things like, voter registration drives, right? Or voter education. So what are the things that you want to know, right? Libraries doing programming around racial justice and how we think about, wanting to and moving towards a more just world for all of us, but in particular centering Black and Indigenous peoples, right? And I think what's great about libraries is they're able to do this at multiple levels, right? So yes, let's bring in someone who is a community organizer who can speak in particular ways. Let's bring in someone who does this work for, elementary school students, and we'll have children's programming, right? And I just think I think sometimes, and this might be sacrilegious, I don't know, but I think sometimes universities think they're doing something. And I'm always like, actually, I think libraries are already doing it and they're doing it better. Maybe that's sacrilegious, I don't know. Sorry to all the university people out there, but I just
tend to agree.
I just think libraries are usually more imaginative spaces, and are willing to think more broadly about audience, about service populations, about the kind of real material, on the ground needs of different peoples. Whereas I think in the university, sometimes we get mired in the kind of ivory tower bubble where we're like, we're just looking at this thing, this one thing, right? And I don't know, I just think more is possible in library spaces.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your thoughts with us. As we're kind of finishing up, I do want to ask you if you have any films or books or podcasts or anything really that you would like to recommend to our audience.
Yes, absolutely. So Natalie knows this about me. I have a laundry list, and I will email it to you later as well. But I'll just limit myself to some of my most recent reads, just because I think they were really great. And then I'll mention a TV show that I've been rewatching, that I've been remembering how much I love all over again. And then I will do a personal plug for an Instagram account that I run that I think maybe people might be interested in. So a couple of books that I can recommend kind of immediately off the bat. Farah Jasmine Griffin wrote a book called Read Until You Understand: The Profound Wisdom of Black Life and Literature. And her book really beautifully encapsulates, I think, a lot of the things that we've talked about today, and a lot of the things that I know, Natalie, you and I've talked about even before this interview. Grace Cho has written a memoir called Tastes Like War. And that it's a really interesting book. In that one, she's writing about her mother, who is a Korean immigrant to the United States, their shared love of food, and then her mother's eventual diagnosis of, if I remember correctly, schizophrenia, and her eventual death. And Grace Cho is kind of working through histories of immigration, histories of empire, thinking about the significance and importance of food for particular communities, right? And also just thinking about the complex relationships that develop between parents and children sometimes, right? Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass was
Classic.
beautiful. Like, it's a very recent read, and I just think there's a chapter in there where she's talking about a student who is defending her thesis, and particular academic colleagues saying, there is no value in this. You don't have a scientific hypothesis. You don't have any of these things. And Kimmerer is writing about how indigenous knowledges and value systems are so often seen as primitive, are so often seen as non-scientific, which is just like, what is the arrogance that you would have to make that kind of call, right?
To look down on indigenous knowledge that's
yes,
right.
Thousands
of years.
It's just, how I feel about this, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
I loved her book for folding that in, and also kind of asking us to rethink the work we think we do as academics. Like, I thought it was such a powerful text for highlighting and centering indigenous epistemologies and knowledge practices, and also asking me, as someone who is less familiar with these knowledges and epistemologies, to kind of think very critically about what it is I think I'm doing, right? And then just in terms of 2 works of fiction, I would recommend Nafisa Thompson-Spires' short story collection, Heads of the Colored People. Number 1, because it's great, but also number 2, it's set in the Inland Empire, right?
Oh, okay, that's very relevant.
The vast majority of the stories are set in like Riverside, Apple Valley, San Bernardino. And not only is it a fantastic short story collection, but it was also great to read because I think when we look at literatures about Black communities in California, we tend to think like Oakland and LA, right? Like, we just kind of think that's the only place, those are the only places where Black people exist. Like, this is our thought process.
Right.
And Thompson-Spires says, I'm gonna write about Riverside, and it's important that we think about Riverside, right? Yeah. So I think maybe for patrons at your library, for very specific reasons, this book might be really interesting. And then because I know that you and I both love genre fiction, I wanted to mention Tamsin Muir's The Locked Tomb series. The first one is called Gideon the Ninth, and the second one is called Harrow the Ninth. And it was going to be a trilogy, but she recently announced there's going to be 4 books. So I'm very excited. It's kind of YA, which is another genre I really love, but it's about queer necromancers and swordsmiths who are also like teenage, like punks with attitude in outer space. Like, of course I'm gonna love it. It's amazing, right?
Of course.
So that's I'll limit myself to that. And then the kind of personal plug, or the TV show I wanted to recommend was I'm rewatching The Golden Girls. And I just want to say, like, since we're talking about women's history,
right.
Of course, as with any text from history, there are particular things that don't work in that show anymore.
Right.
But so much of it still does. Like, it's so powerful in the ways in which the 4 characters address life after kind of heteronormative relationships, right? What it means to take care of one another, the ways in which the show really addressed older women who are in pain being ignored by their doctors, right? And being told that this is just normal aging process and you're making too much of nothing, right? The way that it addressed the AIDS epidemic, right? And the way that it addresses mortality, like all of these different things. I remembered the show being really funny, and it is, but I'd forgotten how profound it can be too.
Right.
So I would recommend it. And then the last kind of personal plug is I run an Instagram account, and it's at a novel femme, and I'll spell it out for you later if you want it. But I started it about 3 years ago now, because what I used to do, what I still do, is I keep record of every new book I read in a year.
Okay.
And I would always do an end of the year recommendation to my friends. And that kind of grew until a lot of people were asking me, like, what did you read this year? Who did you love? Simultaneously with that, I also have a deep love of both skincare and makeup, because I think sometimes skincare and makeup, as they're read as feminine things, there is a huge devaluing of what feminine practices make possible, right? And there's also a huge devaluing of pleasure, right? Like, oh no, like if something is going to be meaningful, it has to be serious. It has to be this, like, no nonsense thing. And I'm like, but doesn't joy matter? Like, doesn't pleasure matter? Doesn't happiness matter? Like, these things are also really important. So I was also talking about makeup and skincare with a lot of my friends. And so I decided to start an Instagram account where I review a book and I pair it with a lipstick.
Oh, that's cool.
Right? So it was like a nerdy kind of thing I started doing, but it was a lot of fun just because it made me reread books I love and like pull out all of my lipsticks and try swatching them and seeing, what fit. And of course, as I start running out of lipsticks, other things start popping in. But if anyone is interested in short book reviews or recommendations for beauty products, it's something that I've been doing for 3 years and I just have a fun time doing it. So if you want to check it out, it's there.